They said I was a good man, but they never saw the night I lied to save and the part of me that never came back. I didn't just take the blame for his crime. I carried the silence that followed. It was raining that night, the kind of rain that blurs the world until everything looks like a mistake. I was at my desk, the old clock ticking on the wall, when I heard the door slam open. Ethan stood there soaked, trembling, and for the first time in years, he couldn't look me in the eye. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. I hit something. At first, I thought he meant an animal. The road outside our town cuts through miles of forest deer raccoons, even the occasional dog. But then I saw the blood on his sleeve, dark and drying, and the dent on the car outside through the window's reflection. My heart stopped. He didn't need to say anything more. I knew. I could feel the truth the way a father feels the storm before it comes. I walked out into the rain without a word. The car was still running. The headlights cut through the mist, revealing streaks of red across the hood. It wasn't just an accident. It was a collision with the kind of fate no man ever walks away from unchanged. Where? I asked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then pointed toward the main road. He ran out of nowhere. I swear I tried to stop. I held up my hand. Enough. There was a silence between us that only rain could fill. I'd spent years teaching my son right from wrong. But that night, I wasn't sure I knew the difference anymore. We drove together following the winding road until the skid marks appeared. The ground was wet and uneven. A shoe lay in the ditch. And there, a few yards away, a man lay motionless under a flickering streetlight. Ethan froze. "Oh, God. He's alive," I said, checking for a pulse. "Barely." Then I looked at Ethan, my son, my only son, and I saw a boy who didn't understand what he'd done. Not yet. "Get back in the car." He didn't move. His lips trembled, his eyes wide like a trapped animal's. "Dad, please." Now. He obeyed, slowly, reluctantly. As I stood there beside the injured man, I could already hear the sirens in the distance, faint, growing louder. I should have waited, should have told the truth. But instead, I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. When the police arrived, I stepped forward before they could ask a single question. "I was driving," I said. "I didn't see him in time." They took me in without hesitation. Ethan never spoke a word. He sat in the car, hands gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead as they cuffed me. I caught one last glimpse of him through the rain-streaked glass, a shadow of a boy I once knew vanishing behind a wall of water and guilt. Inside the station, everything smelled like old coffee and regret. They asked me to sign the report. I did. My hand didn't shake. When the chief looked at me, a man I had once served beside, he sighed. "John, I never thought I'd see your name on this side of the table." "Neither did I said softly. He didn't press further. Men like us understood silence. Sometimes it's the only truth that still holds its shape when words can't. That night in the holding cell, I replayed Ethan's face over and over, the fear, the shame, the youth still clinging to his eyes. And I realized something that tore me apart and put me back together all at once. I hadn't taken the blame for his crime. I'd taken it for his future. The sound of the cell door locking was the sound of a father making peace with damnation. The next morning, when the lawyer came, I didn't ask for defense. Because sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to let the world believe you're guilty. The cell was small, no bigger than the tool shed I kept behind the house. Concrete walls, one narrow bed, a sink that groaned every time I turned the handle. I remember sitting on the edge of that bed, tracing the cracks in the floor, with my eyes realizing how strange it felt to finally be still. For years, I'd chased everything: justice, work, the illusion of control. Now, there was nowhere to go, and the silence had a shape I couldn't escape. I didn't think of the man I'd hit. I thought of Ethan, of how small his hands were the first time I taught him to hold a steering wheel. I could still hear him laughing the way he'd say, "One day, I'll drive better than you." I used to smile at that. Now, the memory cut like glass. When the guard came with breakfast, he asked if I wanted to call someone. I said no. I wasn't ready to hear my wife's voice tremble through the phone, or to imagine the way she'd look at Ethan when she found out. I wanted to hold the lie a little longer, keep it clean before the world touched it. That morning, a lawyer came. A young man, nervous, his tie too tight. He told me the victim was still alive, but in critical condition. If he doesn't make it, he said this could turn into manslaughter. I nodded. I understand. He looked at me strangely, waiting for something: outrage, fear, denial. But I gave him nothing. I'd already spent all of that on the road last night. The trial moved fast. Everyone wanted to believe I was guilty. It made sense: an old man driving late, tired eyes, fading reflexes. They called it negligence. I called it penance. In court, I sat alone. I didn't look at Ethan. He was there, though I could feel it. The weight of his silence pressed against the back of my neck. I kept my eyes on the judge, and when he read the sentence, I simply nodded. 3 years. That's what my son's future was worth. 3 years of my life for the chance that he might one day forgive himself. The first night in prison was the hardest. The sound of metal doors closing. It's something you feel in your chest, not your ears. I lay awake listening to men argue, curse, weep. Somewhere, far down the hall, someone was praying. The words were faint, but steady, like a heartbeat that refused to quit. In the dark, I whispered to no one, "Let him live right." That's all I ask. Days turned into weeks. I worked in the laundry, folding uniforms that never seemed to dry completely. My hands cracked from the soap and cold water, but it kept me grounded. There was something honest about labor. No lies, no excuses, just sweat and repetition. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and imagine Ethan sitting at home staring at my chair at the dinner table. I wondered if he hated me or if he'd begun to understand. Maybe both. Maybe that's what growing up really is, realizing love doesn't always look like kindness. One afternoon, a guard handed me an envelope. No return address, just my name written in a familiar shaky hand. Inside was a single line. "I'm sorry, Dad." I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it under my pillow. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't need to. That small sentence was enough. It meant he was still human, still feeling. The years passed like slow water. When the day of my release finally came, the same rain was falling outside the gate, as if the sky hadn't moved since that night. I stepped out, breathing air that didn't smell like iron and soap, and for the first time in years, I felt weightless, not because I was free, but because I had nothing left to hide. Ethan wasn't there to pick me up. I didn't expect him to be. Some distances can't be closed in a day. I walked home alone through streets that no longer remembered me. The house stood the same weathered, paint-sagging porch, the mailbox I never fixed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and time. There was a photograph still hanging on the wall, the three of us at the lake years ago. Ethan's hair messy, his smile bright, my wife's arm around us both. I stared at it for a long time, and then quietly I whispered to the faces in that frame, I kept my word. Outside thunder rolled again like an echo of that first night. But this time I didn't flinch, because the storm was no longer mine to fear. The days after my release felt heavier than the ones I spent inside. Prison at least had structure: breakfast at 6, work at 8, silence by 10. Out here, time moved without fences, and that kind of freedom can be lonelier than a cell. I spent the first week cleaning the house. It wasn't really dirty. It was just untouched. Dust covered the furniture like years of silence. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like an echo from a life that had already ended. There were still 2 mugs on the kitchen shelf, mine and hers. I didn't have the heart to wash them. At night, I sat by the window, the same one I used to look through when Ethan came home late. The street lights flickered, and sometimes I imagined I could still hear the sound of his car pulling in. But it was only the wind brushing against the trees. I started writing again. Not stories, not letters to anyone in particular, just fragments of thoughts I didn't want to lose. Most of them began with if. If I had told the truth. If he had stayed. If silence hadn't felt so righteous. The pen was slow, my hands stiff, but the words came like rain through cracked glass. And one morning, without meaning to, I found myself writing his name, Ethan. I wrote when you were small. You used to ask me what makes a man good. I told you it was honesty. I was wrong. It's mercy. Because honesty without mercy is just cruelty in disguise. I folded the page and slipped it into an envelope. I didn't plan to send it. It was enough that it existed proof that some part of me still reached for him, even across all the miles of guilt between us. Weeks passed. I fixed the fence, repainted the porch, tried to build a life made of small, quiet things. But the nights still came heavy. I would wake up from dreams where I was back on that road, headlights blinding the rain, falling harder than sound itself. Only this time, Ethan wasn't there. I was on running toward the man in the ditch, shouting for help that never came. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It wasn't from Ethan. It was from the family of the man he'd hit. They wrote that he had survived, but his legs would never fully heal. They didn't blame me. They said the police had closed the case that time, had done what Justice couldn't. At the end of the letter, there was a single line. "We hope you find peace, Mr. Miller. You did what you thought was right." I read that line over and over until the paper softened in my hands. What I thought was right. The phrase turned in my mind like a slow blade. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. Was it right to protect my son at the cost of another man's suffering? Was it right to let the world believe I was guilty when guilt itself had moved on to someone else? That night I went out to the porch, the air cool with the smell of pine and rain. The same rain. It always finds its way back, no matter how many years pass. I took the envelope I'd written for Ethan and placed it on the table beside me. The moonlight touched the ink, and I could almost hear my own voice in the words. I wondered if mercy was truly noble or just cowardice dressed in love. Maybe I'd never know. But I also knew this: if the choice came again, I would still step forward, still raise my hand and say, "It was me." Because a father's duty isn't to live clean. It's to carry the dirt so his child can walk without it. The next morning I walked into town. The people there didn't look at me the same anymore. Some nodded, others turned away. I didn't blame them. Everyone needs a villain to believe in. I'd simply become theirs. At the post office, I held the envelope for a long time before sliding it into the box. I wasn't sure if Ethan would ever read it. Maybe it would get lost. Maybe that was the point. Sometimes the act of reaching out is all that matters, even if no one reaches back. As I walked home, the sky began to clear. The sunlight caught on the wet pavement, turning it into a mirror. For the first time in years, I saw my reflection, older, thinner, but still standing. And I realized something simple, something I'd missed all along. Redemption doesn't arrive like forgiveness. It arrives quietly, in the act of enduring. I went back inside, boiled water for coffee, and sat down with the second mug, hers. The steam rose like a ghost I wasn't afraid of anymore. I looked at the empty chair across from me and said softly, "I'm still here, son, just where you left me." It was late afternoon when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. The kind of sound that doesn't belong to strangers. I looked through the window, and for a second I thought time had folded in on itself. Ethan was standing by the fence, hands in his pockets, staring at the house like he wasn't sure he was welcome. He was taller now. His hair was shorter, his shoulders broader, but the way he stood, 1 foot slightly, turned the same nervous habit he had as a boy that hadn't changed. For a moment, I didn't move. I just watched him. Years of silence condensed into that one breath. When I finally opened the door, he didn't say anything. Neither did I. The wind carried between us what words couldn't. "Hi, Dad," he said at last, voice lower, steadier. "You look older." "I am." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. He entered like a man stepping into a memory, slow, careful, like each piece of furniture might recognize him. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the wall, the one by the lake. He stared at it longer than I expected. "I didn't think this place would still be here," he said quietly. "Some things stay," I answered, "even when they shouldn't." He didn't reply. He just sat at the table where we used to eat breakfast, his fingers tracing the grooves in the wood. I poured him coffee without asking, the same way I always used to. He took a sip and winced. "Still too bitter," he said, and for the briefest second I almost laughed. Silence settled again, but it wasn't heavy this time, just cautious, like two men walking across a frozen river, afraid to break the surface. "I got your letter," he said finally. I froze. I wasn't sure it would reach you. "It did." He paused. I read it a dozen times before I could finish the first line. He set the cup down and looked at me, really looked at me, not like a son looking at his father, but like a man looking at the truth. His eyes had changed. They weren't the eyes of the frightened boy I'd protected. They were older, tempered, but still carrying a weight I recognized. "Why didn't you let me turn myself in?" he asked. His voice didn't shake, but I could hear the storm behind it. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Because you would have spent the rest of your life paying for a single mistake. I've already spent mine learning how to live with them. He shook his head. That's not fair. No, I said, but it's love. The room went quiet again. Outside, the light was fading. Shadows stretched across the floor like long, tired memories. He ran a hand through his hair. Do you know what it's like living every day pretending you're innocent? Yes, I said softly. It's exactly what I've been doing. He swallowed hard, then looked down at his hands. They were trembling. I became a lawyer, Dad. I fight for the truth every day, and the whole time, I've been lying to myself. I watched him, the boy who once hid behind me, now fighting ghosts I couldn't touch. Then stop fighting it, I said. You don't owe me redemption. I owe you everything, he shot back. You went to prison for me. I shook my head. I went for both of us. You think I did it to save you. But the truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of watching you rot from the inside out. I've seen what guilt does to a man. Ethan, it doesn't need bars. He looked up, eyes glistening. You shouldn't have protected me. I should have faced it. Maybe, I said. But then you wouldn't be sitting here. And I wouldn't be looking at a man who's tried to live better than I ever could. He stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. I can't just let it go. Then don't, I said, carry it. Let it remind you, not destroy you. The words hung between us like the quiet before thunder. I didn't plan them. They came from a place deeper than thought, the kind of truth you don't say, to be understood, only to be released. Ethan turned back toward me. His jaw tightened. You forgave me. There was nothing to forgive. He blinked like the meaning of that had to travel a long way to reach him. Then his voice broke. I didn't forgive myself. I stood and crossed the small distance between us. He didn't move when I placed my hand on his shoulder. You will, I said. Not today. But someday you'll look back and realize forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you grow into. His shoulders trembled beneath my palm. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall, steady and calm. When he finally looked up, the last of the light was gone. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. I'll be here. He hesitated at the door, then whispered, I love you, Dad. It had been years since I'd heard those words. They landed softly. Not like forgiveness, not like an ending, but like the first breath of something beginning again. And as the door closed behind him, I realized I was no longer waiting for peace. It was already here, sitting quietly in the chair he'd just left. The next morning, the house felt different. Not cleaner, not brighter, just quieter in a way that didn't ache. The kind of quiet that follows after a storm when everything is still damp, but you can finally breathe again. I made coffee like I always did, 2 cups. I poured one for myself, the other I left untouched on the table. The steam rose gently, catching the sunlight that slipped through the curtain. And for a moment, I imagined Ethan sitting there again, hands wrapped around the mug, trying to find the right words. Forgiveness. It's a strange thing. People talk about it like it's an act, something you give or receive. But I've learned it's more like erosion. Slow, relentless. You don't wake up one morning and forgive someone. You just stop bleeding from the same wound. I walked outside, the air crisp, the ground soft with dew. The fence I'd fixed last month was already leaning again. I smiled at that. Nothing ever stays fixed for long. Not fences, not hearts, not the lies we build to protect what we love. As I was hammering a loose board back into place, I heard footsteps behind me. Ethan's voice followed. You still do everything yourself. I didn't turn around right away. Old habits, I said. He came closer, carrying a paper bag that smelled like coffee and bread. Brought breakfast. We ate in silence. He'd never been good with mornings always. Too many thoughts still tangled from the night before. I didn't rush him. The morning light was soft, and for once it felt like time wasn't something I had to defend. Finally, he said, I told Mom. I stopped mid-bite, and she cried. Then she said she always knew. Said you never could have done it. I nodded slowly. She always saw through me. He looked down at his hands. She wanted me to tell you she forgives you. I laughed quietly. For what? For leaving us behind. For not letting her carry it with you. That hit deeper than I expected. There are wounds you don't notice until someone names them. I stared at the horizon for a long while before I spoke. Tell her. She already did. The day she stayed. Ethan leaned back in the chair, eyes tracing the sky. You know, he said softly, I used to think you were cold, that you didn't care. I cared too much, I said. That's what made me quiet. He smiled faintly. I get that now. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. Sometimes understanding is just the absence of misunderstanding. When he left again that afternoon, he hugged me longer than before. No words. Just that silent exchange that fathers and sons share when they realize love doesn't need to explain itself. After he drove away, I went back inside and found his coffee cup still half full. The sun had shifted, lighting up the spot where he'd been sitting. For the first time, the house didn't feel empty. It felt lived in again. Like life had quietly returned to a place it once avoided. That night I took out my old journal, the one I'd started in prison. Most of it was filled with confessions I never said aloud, but now I turned to a new page and wrote a single line. He's forgiven himself. The sentence is of error. I closed the book and leaned back, eyes heavy but peaceful. Outside, the crickets had started their song, and a thin breeze moved through the open window, brushing against my face. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about letting truth rest, about no longer needing it to hurt. I thought of the man Ethan had hit his broken legs. His life changed forever. Somewhere out there, he was still living, still moving through his own quiet hours. Maybe he'd forgiven us too, in his own way. Or maybe not. It didn't matter anymore. The world doesn't revolve around the peace we find. It just keeps turning, waiting for us to catch up. Before going to bed, I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The lines on my face were deeper, but they didn't look like scars anymore. They looked like maps, reminders of everywhere I'd been, every mistake I'd made, and every truth I'd carried long enough to make peace with. I turned off the light and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, son, not for saving me, but for letting me be human again." A week passed before another letter came. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, deliberate. Like each word had been measured before it landed. The return address was from the city hospital. For a second, I thought it might be paperwork, one more reminder of what I owed the past. But when I opened it, I saw a name that stopped me cold. It was from the man Ethan had hit. He wrote that he'd heard I'd been released. He said he wasn't sure what to write, that words felt useless when a life has already changed shape. I've spent years angry at the man who hit me. The letter began, until I realized that holding on to anger kept me on the road that broke me. He went on to describe his life after the accident, the surgeries, the months of therapy, the nights when pain burned through his legs like fire. Then he said something I didn't expect. "The man who visited me once your son," he told me the truth. I put the letter down. The air thickened around me. Ethan had gone to him. When I kept reading, the next line was simple. I forgave him that day. But I realized the one who needed forgiveness most wasn't him. It was you. I read that line 3 times. My hands shook. He explained that he couldn't understand why I'd done what I did, but that maybe some burdens were meant to protect others, and maybe that was its own kind of justice. "You don't owe me anything," he wrote. "You already paid, not with time, but with silence. And silence, I've learned, is the longest sentence of all." At the end, there was a single request. "If you ever feel ready, come see me. I'd like to walk with you, slowly, maybe awkwardly, but freely." I sat there for a long time, the letter resting on my knees, the sunlight creeping across the table. I'd spent years learning to live with guilt. I hadn't considered what it would mean to live without it. That afternoon, I walked to the bus station. The ride into the city was quiet, the windows streaked with dust and light. Every mile felt heavier, as if memory had its own gravity. When I reached the hospital, I almost turned back. But then I saw him, a man sitting in a wheelchair by the courtyard garden, his hands folded in his lap, His eyes closed against the wind. "Mr. Henderson," I said softly. He opened his eyes and smiled. "I was hoping you'd come." For a moment, I couldn't speak. His face bore the marks of pain and years, but there was warmth there, a peace I hadn't expected. He gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit. The air's good today." I sat. Neither of us spoke for a while. The breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain. "I should say I'm sorry," I finally said. He shook his head. "I already heard that from your son. What I want to know is if you've forgiven yourself." I didn't answer right away. I don't know if that's something I'm allowed to do. Allowed? He chuckled quietly. "Forgiveness isn't permission, Mr. Miller. It's surrender." I looked at him, the man whose pain had rewritten my life. "I thought I was saving him," I said. "Maybe you were," he said. "Or maybe you were saving yourself from seeing him fall apart. Either way, the world's no poorer for what you did. It's just heavier." We sat together for a long while. He told me about his garden, the therapy sessions, how he'd learned to walk again with braces. "The first step hurt like hell," he said, smiling faintly. "But I took it anyway. I guess that's how forgiveness works too." When I left, he pressed the letter back into my hand. "Keep it," he said. "When you forget who you are, read it again." Outside, the air smelled of rain, the same scent that had followed me all these years. I looked up at the gray sky and whispered a small prayer, not for redemption, not for peace, but for the strength to keep walking. As I boarded the bus home, I realized that forgiveness from a stranger carries a strange kind of grace. It doesn't erase what happened, but it changes the way the world holds it. The weight doesn't vanish. It just settles differently, like stones in a river, finding their place at last. When I got back home, I placed the letter on the mantel beside Ethan's cup. 2 acts of forgiveness, one from blood, one from pain, and between them, the quiet life of a man learning, finally, how to live with both. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain had returned soft this time, more like a whisper than a storm. It tapped against the window, steady and patient, as if reminding me that everything, even guilt, eventually finds its rhythm. I sat in my chair by the window, the letter from Mr. Henderson still in my hands. I read it again slower, this time tracing each word as though it carried a pulse. Every sentence felt like it had been written not just to me, but for me, a mirror I hadn't known I needed. He had forgiven me. A man whose life I'd broken, whose body still carried the proof of that night he had let go before I did. That realization was heavier than any verdict. For years I'd thought redemption was something you earn, that you work for it, bleed for it, and only when you've suffered enough are you allowed to feel peace. But now I understood that redemption isn't a prize. It's the quiet decision to stop hiding from the truth even when it still hurts. The clock ticked past midnight. The world outside was still just the rain and the low hum of the wind. I closed my eyes and thought of Ethan as a child, his small hands gripping mine as we crossed the street. He used to ask questions about everything: why the sky changed color, why people cried when they were happy. I used to have answers for him. Now I realize the best ones come too late, when the people who need them have already grown up. I wondered if he'd ever truly understand what I'd done, not the act itself, but the silence that followed. To keep quiet for so long isn't noble. It's lonely. It's carrying a secret so heavy it reshapes your spine. I stood up and walked to the shelf where my old police badge sat in a dusty frame. I hadn't looked at it in years. The metal was dull, the edges worn. I used to think that badge meant something, that it stood for justice, truth, order. But now I saw it differently. Justice without mercy is just another kind of cruelty. I took the badge out of the frame and held it in my hand. It felt lighter than I remembered. Maybe because it no longer carried the illusion of who I used to be. I placed it gently on the table beside Henderson's letter and whispered, "You can rest now." The next morning, I went to the backyard. The earth was damp, soft under my boots. The air was cool, the kind of cool that carries both endings and beginnings. I found a small patch under the oak tree, the same tree Ethan used to climb when he was young. I knelt down and dug a small hole. Then I buried the badge. It wasn't an act of shame. It was closure. That badge had served its time, just like me. When I stood back up, I noticed something simple: the morning light breaking through the branches, scattering across the ground like fragments of gold. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like permission. Inside, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The aroma filled the room, warm and grounding. As I poured myself a cup, I realized how different it tasted. Not because the coffee had changed, but because I had. I sat back down and opened my journal again. On a clean page, I wrote, "Redemption isn't found in forgiveness. It's found in the courage to keep living after it." The pen slipped slightly at the end, my hand shaking from age or emotion, maybe both. I closed the book and rested my palm on the cover. The rain had stopped. Outside, the world was quiet again. Later that evening, I received a call. It was Ethan. His voice was calm, lighter somehow. "Dad," he said, "I went to see him too." I didn't have to ask who he meant. He told me, "You came." Ethan continued. "He said you both walked together for a while. He said you looked free." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Maybe I was," I said. He hesitated before speaking again. "I've been thinking, Dad, about everything. About what it means to make peace with what we can't change." "What did you figure out?" I asked. He paused. That maybe peace isn't about forgetting what we did. It's about remembering it without hating ourselves anymore. His words landed softly, like something that had been waiting years to be said. "You're learning," I said. "So are you," he replied. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the hum of the dial tone fading into silence. I looked out the window again. The moon had come out pale and steady, watching over the world like an old friend who didn't need to speak to be understood. And in that quiet, I finally felt it. Not relief, not joy, but something simpler and truer. Peace. The sun came early that morning. It poured through the curtains like forgiveness, spilling over everything it touched. The house smelled of rain and coffee, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't wake with the weight of yesterday pressing on my chest. I sat by the window, watching the road curve away from the house. That road had taken so much from me: peace, certainty, years. But it had also given me back something I never expected: the chance to face my life without bitterness. Around 8, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I didn't move. I already knew who it was. Ethan stepped out, carrying a small wooden box. He looked lighter, somehow, like the man who'd walked away weeks ago, had left his guilt behind, somewhere between then and now. "Morning, Dad," he said, closing the door gently. "Morning." He held the box close. "I brought something." I motioned for him to come inside. He sat down at the table and set the box between us. For a moment, neither of us opened it. The silence felt sacred, not empty. "It's for you," he said finally. I lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, old ones I hadn't seen in years. Me, him, and his mother at the lake. Him on his bike. A picture of us fixing the fence, both covered in dirt, laughing. But at the bottom, there was one more thing: my police badge. The same one I had buried. I stared dead at it. "Where did you—" "I found it," he said. "I went to the house while you were gone. I saw the patch of earth under the tree. I think I understood why you left it there." He looked up at me. Then his eyes calm, clear. "You buried it because it wasn't who you were anymore. But I think you forgot something. It wasn't the badge that made you a good man." I swallowed hard. "Then what did?" "The way you carried its weight long after you put it down." I didn't know what to say. The years between us, all the silence, the shame, the distance, they seemed to fade, replaced by something fragile, but alive. He reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope. "Mr. Henderson passed away last week," he said quietly. "He asked me to give you this." My chest tightened as I opened it. There were only a few words written in the same careful hand as before. "The pain is gone. The road has no end. Keep warm." I folded the letter, my eyes burning, not from grief, but from the kind of emotion that cleanses instead of breaks. I set it beside the photographs. Ethan watched me. He forgave us both, Dad. I nodded. I know. But forgiveness is strange, isn't it? It's never really given it's recognized, like it's been sitting there the whole time, waiting for us to notice. He smiled. I think you just did. The air between us was soft light filtering through the window, like something divine. He looked around the room, then back at me. You ever think of moving, getting out of here? I shook my head. No. This place know too much about me. It'd be rude to leave it behind. He laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that sounds like it comes from deep in the bones. You never change. I hope not, I said. It took me 50 years to get this way. We stepped outside a little later. The yard glistened with dew. The old oak tree stood tall, its roots deep and steady. Ethan stopped beneath it, looking down at the spot where I'd buried the badge. You were right to bury it, he said. But maybe it doesn't have to stay there. He knelt and placed a small stone over the ground, not as a marker of loss, but as a symbol of rest. Now it's where it belongs, he whispered. We stood there in silence. The breeze moved gently through the branches. The world didn't look smaller or larger, just enough. Ethan turned to me. You know, I used to wish I could undo that night. Now I don't, because if I did, I'd lose the man I became and the father I finally understand. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Then we both learned what we were meant to. He nodded. I should go soon. I've got a hearing this afternoon. Go do your job, I said. Do it right. He smiled. I will. Because you taught me what right really means. When he drove away, I stayed under the tree, listening to the sound of the engine fading down the road. The world was quiet again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was whole. I looked at the sky, a clear, endless blue, and felt something I hadn't felt since before that night. Not innocence, not relief, something simpler. Freedom. That evening, I walked alone down the same road where everything had begun. The asphalt was cracked. Now the lines faded. The years had worn it down just like they had worn me down, and yet somehow it was still here. That felt right. Not everything broken needs fixing. Some things just need to be understood. The air was warm, the scent of pine heavy after the rain. Every few steps, I could hear my boots brush against the gravel, steady and slow. For years, this sound haunted me. Now, it sounded like prayer. People think redemption is a single moment, a confession, a handshake, a tear. But I've learned it's not. It's a process that starts long before you realize you've begun, and it doesn't end even when you think it has. It's in the way you wake up each day and choose to keep living, even when there's nothing left to prove. I stopped where the accident had happened. The road curved slightly there, just enough to hide what's coming until it's too late. I remembered the flashing lights, the rain, the smell of iron and smoke. But it felt distant now, like watching a movie I'd already seen too many times. I knelt down and ran my hand over the cracked pavement. "It's over," I said softly. The words weren't for the road. They were for me. A car passed in the distance. Its headlights cut through the mist. And for a brief second, I saw my reflection in the glare. Older, slower, but unafraid. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, and began the walk back home. The house waited in its usual quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for company. I made tea this time, not coffee, something lighter, gentler. I sat by the window again, the same spot where I had watched Ethan drive away that morning. The sun was dipping low, turning everything gold. I thought about all the versions of myself. I'd been the young officer chasing justice, the father desperate to protect his son, the prisoner learning patience, the old man learning peace. Each one had died a little so the next could live. Maybe that's what growth really is, a series of small funerals for the people we used to be. On the wall above the table, there was still that photograph, the three of us by the lake. The edges had begun to fade, the colors turning softer with time. I looked at my younger face and felt no anger, no regret, just gratitude. That man didn't know what was coming, but he stood through it anyway. I reached for my journal again and wrote, "There is no such thing as wasted pain, only delayed understanding." The pen scratched faintly against the paper. The sound was small, but it felt infinite. Later I stepped outside. The evening light had turned everything amber. The oak tree stood still, the stone Ethan had placed resting firmly at its roots. I touched it gently, the way one might touch a gravestone, not in mourning, but in respect. For years I thought silence was my punishment. But now I see it was my teacher. It taught me how to listen to others, to the world, to the parts of myself I used to drown out with duty and pride. A breeze moved through the yard, carrying with it the faint smell of rain-soaked earth. I closed my eyes and let it pass over me. I remembered Mr. Henderson's words, Heap, walking. And I understood now walking wasn't about moving forward. It was about staying present, step after step, no matter how heavy the ground beneath you feels. I went back inside, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark for a while. The darkness didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt earned, like a soft blanket over a tired soul. I whispered almost without thinking, "You did enough, John." And for once I believed it. Outside the crickets began to sing. The night was calm, the stars dim but steady. Somewhere down the road, a new day was already making its way toward me. Morning again. The sky looks softer today, a gray that isn't sad, just honest. I've come to like mornings like this. They don't ask for anything. They simply arrive and in their quiet way, remind you that you've been given one more chance to breathe. I sit on the porch with my coffee, watching the mist drift through the trees. The world has started to slow down for me. Not because I've stopped caring, but because I finally learned that not everything broken needs to be repaired. Some things are meant to stay unfinished, like conversations that end with silence, or love that ends with distance. Ethan visits every Sunday now. We don't talk much about the past. We talk about his work, about his mother's garden, about small things that don't carry weight, but fill the air between us. And that's enough. The past doesn't need to be rewritten. It just needs to stop shouting. Sometimes when he's here, I catch him looking at me not with guilt, not even with pity, but with something gentler. Understanding, maybe. The kind of look that says he's finally forgiven himself. That's how I know I did something right, even if the world never saw it that way. There's a peace in knowing your story won't be told correctly. People will remember the parts that make sense to them. The arrest, the sentence, the headlines. They'll never know the quiet moments, the small decisions that kept someone else's light alive. But that's all right. Truth doesn't need an audience. Sometimes at night, I still dream of that road, the rain, the headlights, the silence after the crash. But now, when I walk through it in my mind, it ends differently. The road doesn't lead to a cell anymore. It leads home. The man in the ditch stands up, nods, and walks away. And I keep walking too. Not toward punishment, not toward forgiveness, just forward. The oak tree in the yard has started to bloom again. Each year, it seems to stretch a little wider, its roots sinking deeper into the earth. I like to think of it as a marker, not of what happened, but of what endured. Ethan's stone still sits beneath it. Sometimes I see birds perched there in the morning, their small claws resting on that symbol of rest and release. Even they seem to understand. The badge sits on the shelf inside now. I didn't dig it up. Ethan did. But I kept it where he left it. Not as a relic, not as guilt, just as a reminder that even the hardest symbols can lose their sharp edges when you stop holding them like weapons. I once believed strength was about control, about keeping your world in order. Now I know strength is gentler. It's the ability to let things be imperfect, to sit with pain without trying to fix it, to hold your regrets the way you hold a sleeping child, carefully, quietly, knowing it's yours, but also knowing it will wake eventually and walk away. I look at my hands sometimes, rough-lined, slower than they used to be, and I realize they've built, buried, and released everything I've ever loved. That's not something to mourn. It's something to bow to. Life doesn't owe us understanding. It just gives us the tools to find our own. When the light hits just right, I can see dust floating through the air. Tiny particles catching sunlight, dancing in silence. I think that's what forgiveness feels like. Not a burst of glory, not a grand gesture, just a quiet shimmer in a room you thought was empty. The world moves on as it always does. The grass grows over old roads. The names fade from the paper. The pain becomes a story you tell only to yourself. And one morning, you wake up and realize that the story was never about the crime. It was about the man who kept walking after it. I finished my coffee, the last of it cold at the bottom of the cup. The air smells like rain again. I set the mug down beside me and closed my eyes. The sound of the wind moves through the trees like a voice I once knew, patient, steady, unjudging. Maybe that's what redemption sounds like. Not applause, not forgiveness. Just wind passing through open branches, here and then gone. And I think to myself, as the morning fades into day, I took the blame for my son's crime. But in doing so, I found the part of me that could still love without needing to be right. And that, I think, was the only truth worth keeping.